She judged him, mocked him, and dismissed him every day, but when her child's life was on the line and no one else came to help, he became the hero she never expected. What happens next will change everything. What if the person you insult, humiliate, or judge today becomes the only one who can save you tomorrow? Life is unpredictable, and tables turn when you least expect it. Before you act on hate or prejudice, think twice, because the strength of the very person you mistreat might be the one thing you will need to survive. Think twice before you judge or mistreat someone, because life has a way of turning tables. The person you humiliate today might be the one who saves you tomorrow. Kindness and respect are never wasted. Choose them over hate. Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories. Thanks. Let's start the story. It was a crisp morning in Maplewood, a quiet suburban neighborhood where the lawns were perfectly trimmed, the mailboxes stood like sentinels, and families went about their day in predictable routines. It was the kind of neighborhood that prided itself on its safety and serenity, though it wasn't without its minor issues. Lately, packs of stray dogs had begun wandering the streets, their presence ignored by most residents. Complaints were whispered, but no one acted decisively, believing the issue would resolve itself. Laura Whitman was no stranger to this inaction. A middle-aged woman with sharp features and an air of entitlement, she often viewed herself as the unspoken authority of Maplewood. She lived in a pristine white house with navy shutters, a manicured garden, and a knack for letting her opinions be known, especially when it came to her black neighbor, Anthony Green. Laura's disdain for Anthony was rarely overt but always pointed. She would mock his modest car, his quiet demeanor, and the way he seemed to stand out in a neighborhood she deemed reserved for families like hers. People like him must feel so out of place here, she'd say during her book club meetings, her words dripping with condescension. To her, Anthony was a puzzle that didn't quite fit, and she didn't care to understand why. Anthony, in contrast, was a man of quiet strength. In his late 30s, he carried himself with a dignity that belied the undercurrent of racism he encountered from neighbors like Laura. A soft-spoken and gentle individual, he spent his days running a local child and women welfare foundation, dedicating his life to helping others. While Laura belittled him with subtle jabs about his work and presence in the neighborhood, Anthony chose not to engage. He met her veiled insults with a calm smile, preferring to focus on his purpose rather than petty confrontations. That morning, Laura's 8-year-old son, Ethan, was playing in the yard. Energetic and curious, he often tested the boundaries his mother set, wandering further than he should. Today was no different. With a small soccer ball tucked under his arm, he ventured down the street, his attention drawn by a fluttering butterfly that led him further than he realized. As he neared the edge of the neighborhood, a low growl broke the silence. Ethan froze. A pack of stray dogs, their fur matted and their eyes wild, had emerged from behind a cluster of bushes. The dogs surrounded him, barking and snapping at the air. Ethan clutched his ball tightly, his small frame trembling. "Help!" he screamed, his voice breaking with fear. "Mom! Somebody! Please! Help!" The dogs yelped and moaned. Lara was inside, her coffee steaming on the kitchen counter, when she heard the faint cries. At first she brushed it off, thinking Ethan was calling out to her friend, but the urgency in his voice grew louder, cutting through her thoughts. She rushed to the window, her heart sinking as she saw her son cornered by the snarling dogs. Panic overtook her as she threw open the door and ran toward him, her slippers slapping against the pavement. "Ethan!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she waved her arms. The dogs growled louder, their attention briefly shifting to her before snapping back to the frightened boy. Laura hesitated, unsure of what to do. She tried shouting louder, but her voice only seemed to agitate the animals further. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked around desperately. "Help!" she yelled at the top of her lungs, glancing toward the neighboring houses. Curtains rustled and doors cracked open slightly, but no one came forward. The fear in her voice was palpable, but the scene unfolding was enough to keep her neighbors frozen in place, unwilling to risk their own safety. Laura's hands trembled as she called out again, her voice breaking. "Please, someone! Help my son!" And then, from across the street, Anthony Green appeared. He had been watering his small vegetable garden when the commotion reached him. For a moment he stood still, taking in the scene, the panicked mother, the frightened child, and the snarling pack of stray dogs. Without hesitation, he set down his watering can and began moving toward them, his calm demeanor giving no hint of the danger he was about to face. As he approached, Laura turned, her eyes locking with his. For the first time in years, her expression wasn't one of condescension, but pure desperation. She didn't have to say a word. The plea was written all over her face. Laura's voice cracked as she shouted for help, her desperation filling the quiet suburban street. "Please, someone, help my son!" she yelled again, her hands trembling as she waved toward the neighboring houses. A curtain twitched in the house across the street, and a door opened just a crack, but no one came outside. The neighbors, hearing the vicious growls and seeing the snarling dogs, were hesitant to intervene, frozen by their own fears. Ethan's screams grew louder as the dogs inched closer, their sharp teeth bared and their growls growing more ferocious. His small hands clutched the soccer ball to his chest as a shield, but his knees buckled under the weight of his terror. One of the dogs lunged forward, nipping at his sleeve, tearing the fabric. Ethan shrieked and stumbled backward, his cries echoing down the empty street. Laura's heart pounded as she darted toward the scene, shouting and flailing her arms. "Get away! Leave him alone!" she cried, her voice trembling. The dogs turned their heads toward her briefly, their growls deepening as if warning her to stay back. She froze for a moment, realizing the danger she was in. The pack's aggression wasn't just directed at Ethan, it could turn on her just as quickly. She grabbed a small stone from the ground and hurled it toward the pack, but it only seemed to escalate their aggression. One of the dogs snapped its jaws, while another barked sharply, stepping closer to Ethan, who was now shaking uncontrollably. Laura was overwhelmed, her legs trembling beneath her. Her shouts for help became hoarse, her vision blurred with tears. The realization that no one was coming gripped her like a vice. Then, through the chaos, Anthony Green emerged. He had been tending to his small garden when he heard the commotion. Setting his tools down, he stood still for a moment, taking in the scene, the pack of dogs, the terrified child, and Laura, usually so composed, reduced to a figure of sheer panic. His calm eyes met the chaos in front of him, and without a moment's hesitation, he moved forward. Anthony strode purposefully across the street, grabbing a sturdy branch from a tree as he approached. His movements were confident but measured, his presence radiating a quiet authority. "Stay back," he said firmly to Laura as he passed her, his voice steady but commanding. "I'll handle this." The dogs growled louder as Anthony neared, their attention shifting to him. He didn't flinch. Instead, he used the branch in his hand to tap the ground, creating sharp, deliberate sounds to distract the pack. His voice cut through the growls as he spoke to the dogs in a low, steady tone. "Back off," he said, his voice firm but not threatening. He took another step forward, positioning himself between the pack and Ethan. The dogs hesitated, their growls faltering as they reacted to Anthony's presence. He didn't make any sudden movements, instead holding the branch out as a barrier while maintaining eye contact with the most aggressive of the group. "You don't want this fight," he muttered. Slowly but deliberately, he guided Ethan away from the pack, using his body as a shield. He slid from the crowd to the side of the trail and began to peek among the passing travelers for any mark of pain. Ethan clung to Anthony's leg, his small hands gripping the fabric of his pants as he sobbed. "It's okay, buddy," Anthony said softly, his tone now gentle and reassuring. "I've got you." One of the dogs lunged, barking sharply, but Anthony tapped the branch against the pavement with enough force to send a sharp crack echoing through the air. The dog yelped and backed away, and the others began to retreat, their aggression replaced by uncertainty. Within moments, the pack had scattered, disappearing down the street as quickly as they had appeared. With the immediate danger gone, Anthony knelt beside Ethan, gently placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice calm and kind. Ethan shook his head, tears streaming down his cheeks as he tried to catch his breath. Anthony smiled softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from Ethan's face. "You're safe now," he said. "You're a brave little guy." Laura, who had been frozen in place, finally found the strength to move. She ran to Ethan, collapsing to her knees beside him and pulling him into a tight embrace. "Oh, thank God," she whispered, her voice trembling. She looked up at Anthony, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said, her words faltering. I don't even know what to say." Anthony stood, helping Ethan to his feet before turning to Laura. "He's okay," he said simply, his tone matter-of-fact. "But you should take him inside and check for any scratches or bites, just to be safe." Laura nodded, her hand still trembling as she clutched Ethan's hand tightly. For a moment she stared at Anthony, struggling to reconcile the man standing before her with the image she had held of him for so long. The man she had mocked, dismissed, and judged had just saved her son's life without hesitation, risking his own safety in the process. I don't know how to thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Anthony shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You don't have to," he replied. "Just take care of him." As Anthony turned to leave, Laura watched him go, her emotions a tangle of gratitude, guilt, and disbelief. She held Ethan close, her heart still racing as she tried to process what had just happened. The man she had spent years dismissing as unworthy of her respect had just demonstrated more courage and kindness than she could have ever imagined. The weight of her own prejudices pressed down on her, but for the first time, she felt the faint stirrings of something else. Understanding. Laura followed Anthony cautiously as he carried Ethan into his home, her hands still trembling from the ordeal. She wasn't sure what to expect. For years, she had painted Anthony in her mind as someone beneath her, a man who didn't belong in their neighborhood, someone whose life was, at best, unimpressive. But the way he had stepped in to save her son, without hesitation, had already begun to dismantle the assumptions she had clung to so firmly. As they entered Anthony's house, Laura was struck by how warm and welcoming it felt. The living room was modestly decorated, but it exuded a sense of care and thoughtfulness. A bookshelf filled with well-worn titles lined one wall, and photos of smiling children and families adorned another. A soft blanket was draped over a couch, and a small vase of fresh flowers sat on the coffee table. It was nothing like the cold, disorganized image Laura had imagined. Anthony set Ethan down gently on the couch, his calm demeanor putting both the boy and Laura slightly at ease. "Let's check him over," Anthony said, kneeling in front of Ethan. "You did great out there, buddy. I just want to make sure you're okay." Ethan nodded, his small hands still gripping Anthony's shirt. His wide, tear-filled eyes began to relax as Anthony reassured him with a steady voice. Anthony carefully inspected Ethan's arms and legs for scratches or bites, all while keeping his tone light and encouraging. "See? Nothing too bad," he said with a gentle smile. "Just a little scrape here, but nothing a bandage can't fix." Laura stood silently, taking in the scene. She was still shaken, not just by the attack, but by the man kneeling before her. This was the same neighbor she had mocked for years, the man whose quiet presence she had dismissed as insignificant. And now, here he was, comforting her son and treating him with a kindness that she didn't feel she deserved. "I'm going to call someone to double-check," Anthony said, rising to his feet. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Laura watched as he spoke, her curiosity growing with every word. His tone was professional and composed, but what struck her most was the way the person on the other end of the line responded. There was a clear respect in the conversation, a tone that suggested Anthony wasn't just anyone. "Yes, I'll need someone to stop by and check on him," Anthony said. "It's nothing serious, but I want to be sure." He paused, listening, before nodding and adding, "Thank you. I'll owe you one." When Anthony ended the call, Laura couldn't hold back her curiosity any longer. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "You sounded official," Dr. Felice replied. Anthony chuckled softly, brushing his hands on his jeans. "That was one of the doctors I work with. I run a local foundation, Child and Women Welfare. We help kids and families in difficult situations. Sometimes we deal with medical emergencies, so I've built up a network of people I can rely on." Laura blinked, the weight of his words sinking in. "You run a foundation?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I had no idea." Anthony nodded modestly. "It's not something I talk about much around here. I prefer to let the work speak for itself. But yes, I've been doing this for about a decade now. We focus on providing education, healthcare, and shelter to kids in need. It's fulfilling, Laura didn't know how to respond. She felt her chest tighten as she realized how much she had underestimated him. For years, she had mocked Anthony as someone who didn't belong in their neighborhood, someone who wasn't worth her respect. Yet here he was, not only saving her son, but revealing a life of extraordinary purpose and compassion. As Anthony spoke about his work, Laura found herself flooded with memories. Moments she had chosen to forget, but now surfaced with painful clarity. She remembered the time she had laughed about his old car with a neighbor, calling it a clunker that didn't belong on their street. She recalled how she had refused to acknowledge him at a community event, dismissing his polite attempts to make conversation. And worst of all, she thought about the many times she had made cutting remarks to his face, questioning his worth in veiled language she knew he would understand. The shame hit her like a wave. How could she have been so blind, so cruel? Anthony had endured her mockery for years, yet he had never retaliated, never let her words affect his kindness. And today, when her son's life was in danger, he had stepped up without hesitation, risking himself to ensure Ethan's safety. I don't know what to say," Laura murmured, her voice breaking. "You've done so much. And I've been so horrible to you." Anthony glanced at her, his expression calm but unreadable. "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. "We all have our moments. What matters is what we do moving forward." Laura looked away, tears welling in her eyes. She thought about the photos on his wall, the bookshelf filled with stories of resilience and hope, and the warmth that radiated from his home. Everything about Anthony contradicted the image she had constructed of him in her mind. He wasn't just a good man. He was someone who had dedicated his life to making the world better, one person at a time. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" she asked quietly. When I treated you the way I did, why didn't you call me out on it?" Anthony smiled faintly. "Because it wouldn't have changed anything. People don't change because they're told to. They change when they're ready to see things differently. Besides," he added, his tone lightening, "I have more important things to focus on." This solves. Laura felt her face flush with guilt. For years, she had been so wrapped up in her own assumptions and prejudices that she had failed to see the truth about Anthony. And now, standing in his home, she realized how much she had misjudged him, not just as a neighbor, but as a person. Anthony's phone buzzed and he glanced at the screen. "That'll be the doctor," he said, moving toward the door. "Let me get them settled." As he stepped away, Laura sat down on the couch beside Ethan, who was still clutching his soccer ball tightly. She wrapped her arms around him, her heart heavy with a mix of gratitude and regret. For the first time in her life, she felt the full weight of what her actions had meant, not just to Anthony, but to herself. The reality of Anthony's achievements and the kindness he had shown her family left her overwhelmed. She had spent years judging him, dismissing him as less than, while he had been quietly building a life of purpose and impact. And now, after everything, he had forgiven her without a second thought. Together, as she sat in his home, surrounded by the evidence of his generosity and resilience, Laura realized that her perspective had shifted in a way she couldn't ignore. Anthony wasn't just her neighbor. He was a reminder of the person she wanted to become. As the doctor left Anthony's home, assuring Laura that Ethan was fine and only needed rest, she finally let out the breath she had been holding. The weight of everything that had happened that day bore down on her. She glanced at Anthony, who was tidying up the supplies the doctor had used, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But to Laura, it felt like the world had shifted. Her son's life had been in danger, and the man she had spent years dismissing had been the one to save him. The shame she felt was suffocating, Her voice trembled as she finally spoke, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Anthony," she began, her eyes welling up with tears. "I need to say something." Anthony turned to her, his calm expression unchanging. He didn't speak, allowing her the space to gather her thoughts. Laura's words came out in bursts, her voice shaky and full of emotion. I owe you an apology. Not just for today, but for everything. For the way I've treated you, the way I've judged you. I've been awful to you for so long, and yet you didn't hesitate to save my son. Her hands trembled as she clutched her knees. I don't understand how you could be so kind to someone like me after everything I've done. Anthony stood quietly for a moment, his eyes steady but soft. Laura, he said gently, you don't need to explain. I've known how you felt about me for a long time. His words hit her like a blow. She looked away, ashamed to meet his gaze. I was so wrong, she whispered. I was wrong about everything. Her skin felt so warm that the tip of her nose felt like it might flame. So, Anthony moved to sit across from her, his presence calm and reassuring. We're all human, Laura, he said, and we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do moving forward. Laura looked at her daughter. Laura shook her head, tears streaming down her face. You're being too kind. I don't deserve it. The things I've said, the way I've acted, it was all rooted in ignorance and prejudice. And today, when Ethan needed help, no one else came, but you did, without hesitation. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. You saved his life. You saved my life because I wouldn't have been able to live with myself if something had happened to him. Anthony smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. It wasn't about deserving, Laura. It was about doing the right thing. You're his mother, and he needed you to be okay. That's all that mattered to me in that moment. Laura sobbed quietly, overwhelmed by the grace in his words. How can you say that after everything? How can you be so forgiving? Anthony's face softened, his voice steady as he spoke. Because I've learned that carrying anger doesn't help anyone. It only weighs you down. And because I believe in actions, not judgments. What you said or did in the past didn't matter to me today. What mattered was Ethan, that's all. His words silenced her. For years, she had carried her biases as if they were justified, never once questioning the harm they might cause. Now, faced with Anthony's unwavering kindness, she felt those biases crumble under the weight of her guilt and his grace. Thank you, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for being a better person than I ever was. I thought I wanted all to go away somehow, but Anthony smiled again, a small but genuine expression. It's not about being better, Laura. It's about trying to do the right thing, even when it's hard. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment settling over them both. For Laura, this wasn't just an apology, it was a reckoning. She had spent years defining Anthony by her own assumptions, never bothering to see the truth of who he was. And now, after everything, he had shown her more kindness and understanding than she had ever shown him. Anthony stood and glanced toward Ethan, who had fallen asleep on the couch. He's gonna be okay, he said softly. That's what matters most. A small smile spread across Anthony's face. Laura rose to her feet, still feeling the heaviness of her emotions. You've given me more than I can ever repay, she said. But I promise you, Anthony, I'll do better. I'll be better. Dear, dear face, I. Anthony nodded, his expression encouraging but not overbearing. I believe you will, he said simply, and if there's ever anything I can do to help, just let me know. Laura managed a small smile through her tears. For the first time in years, she saw Anthony not as a neighbor, not as a man she had judged, but as someone who had quietly lived a life of purpose and compassion. And in that moment, she resolved to carry his lesson with her, to judge less, to listen more, and to let her actions speak louder than her words ever could. As she gathered Ethan in her arms and prepared to leave, she turned back to Anthony one last time. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steady this time. Anthony gave her a warm smile, his hands in his pockets. "Take care, Laura," he said, his tone light. "And don't worry, kids are resilient. He'll bounce back faster than you think." Laura stepped out into the crisp evening air. Ethan nestled against her shoulder. As she walked home, she realized that her life had changed irrevocably in just a few hours. And for the first time in a long time, she felt grateful, not just for Anthony's actions, but for the lesson he had taught her about humanity, forgiveness, and the power of doing what's right. Back at home, Laura sat on the edge of her couch, staring at a photograph of her family on the mantel. Ethan was asleep in his room, his breathing steady and calm after the chaos of the day. Yet Laura's mind was anything but calm. Her thoughts swirled as she replayed the events that had unfolded, Ethan's cries for help, the era's as tumult in the streets of Montreal, Ethan's words that lingered. But more than anything, it was Anthony's words that lingered. We're all human, and we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do moving forward. Those words felt like a mirror held up to her soul, reflecting the years she had spent judging and belittling, not just Anthony, but others she had deemed different or beneath her. She thought about the times she'd turned her nose up at neighbors who didn't fit her narrow view of who belonged in their community. She thought about the jokes she'd made at Anthony's expense, the cold dismissals when he'd offered a friendly wave or a polite hello, and the sighs belying her judgment. Her chest tightened with shame, but alongside it was a growing resolve. This wasn't who she wanted to be, not anymore. Anthony's actions had shown her a different path, one built on kindness, grace, and the power of forgiveness. For the first time in years, Laura felt a deep need to change, not just for herself, but for Ethan, who was watching and learning from her every day. The next morning, Laura walked Ethan to school, holding his hand tightly as they made their way down the quiet streets. She noticed neighbors along the way, people she had barely acknowledged in the past. She smiled and waved, surprising a few who had grown accustomed to her aloofness. She stopped to chat briefly with an elderly man tending to his garden, and complimented the flowers that had always caught her eye, but never her words. It felt small, but to Laura, it was a start. At home, Laura began encouraging Ethan to treat others with kindness and respect, no matter their background or circumstances. She told him about the importance of understanding people's stories before making assumptions, of giving others the benefit of the doubt. Ethan listened, his young mind absorbing her words, though it was clear he already admired Anthony deeply. "Mom," he said one evening, "I want to be like Mr. Green when I grow up." Hearing those words filled Laura with both pride and a bittersweet ache. She knew she was raising Ethan to be better than she had been, and that was enough. A week later, Laura decided it wasn't enough to quietly reassess her life. Anthony deserved more than silent gratitude. She wanted to show him, and the rest of the neighborhood, the impact he had made, not just by saving Ethan, but by teaching her what it meant to be a good person. Laura began organizing a small neighborhood gathering, something she had avoided in the past. She reached out to neighbors with invitations, explaining the purpose of the event, to thank Anthony and raise awareness about his foundation. She shared the story of what had happened with Ethan, her voice trembling as she recounted how Anthony had stepped in when no one else did. "He didn't just save my son's life," she told them. "It opened my eyes to what truly matters." The day of the gathering arrived, and Laura was overwhelmed by the turnout. Families from all over the neighborhood filled her backyard, chatting and sharing laughter. There was an energy in the air that felt new, warmer, more connected. And at the center of it all was Anthony, who stood humbly as Laura took the microphone. "Today, we're here to thank someone who showed us what courage, kindness, and selflessness look like," Laura began, her voice steady but emotional. She looked toward Anthony, who stood near the edge of the crowd. "Anthony Green didn't just save my son's life. He reminded me of the importance of seeing people for who they truly are, not for who we assume them to be." She went on to share his work with the Child and Women Welfare Foundation, encouraging her neighbors to support his mission. "Anthony has spent his life helping those in need, and it's time we recognize and celebrate that. If you can donate, volunteer, or spread the word about his foundation, I hope you'll join me in doing so." The crowd erupted into applause, and Anthony gave a small, modest wave, his usual calm demeanor intact. As the event continued, neighbors approached him to offer their thanks and learn more about his work. For the first time, it felt as though the community truly saw him, not as an outsider, but as someone they were lucky to have in their midst. As the sun set and the crowd began to disperse, Laura stood on her porch with Ethan, watching Anthony walk back to his home. He carried a box of thank you cards and donations from the gathering, a faint smile playing on his lips. Laura raised her hand in a wave, and Anthony looked up, returning the gesture warmly. Ethan, perched on the edge of the porch, called out, "Thank you, Mr. Green." Anthony paused for a moment, his smile widening before he nodded and continued on his way. Laura sat down beside Ethan, pulling him close as they watched Anthony disappear into his house. Her thoughts were quieter now, more focused. For years, she had let her judgments cloud her perspective, but today, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not just for herself, but for her community, her son, and the future they could build together. As the evening air grew cooler, Laura closed her eyes, reflecting on everything Anthony had taught her. His forgiveness, his humility, his ability to lead by example. They were lessons she would carry with her forever. And as she sat there, her heart full, she thought of the words that now guided her. We're all human, and our true worth lies in our actions, not in our judgments of others. Laura's journey is a powerful example of how personal experiences can shatter deeply rooted prejudices. Her initial behavior toward Anthony, filled with condescension and judgment, stemmed from assumptions she had never questioned. When faced with his bravery and selflessness in saving her son, her perspective begins to shift. This transformation is a testament to the potential for growth when people allow themselves to see beyond stereotypes and acknowledge the humanity in others. The change in Laura's outlook shows that it's never too late to seek redemption and make amends for past mistakes. Anthony's character reveals the depth of empathy and forgiveness. Despite enduring years of humiliation and dismissive behavior from Laura, he chooses to rise above resentment. When Ethan's life is in danger, Anthony acts decisively, putting aside personal grievances to do what is right. His ability to forgive Laura after all she had done is a reflection of his strength and values. His response to her apology inspires not just Laura but the entire community, demonstrating that forgiveness is not about excusing behavior, but about freeing oneself from bitterness and choosing understanding instead. Through his actions, Anthony proves that deeds speak louder than words. While Laura's judgments had been based on assumptions and superficial observations, it is Anthony's quiet courage and selflessness that redefine how she sees him. His consistent kindness and the way he handled the crisis show the transformative power of leading by example. In the end, Anthony doesn't just save a child. He inspires a community to reflect on their biases and recognize the importance of compassion and unity. This story, with its focus on redemption, empathy, and the impact of one person's actions, resonates with universal truths. It challenges readers to examine their own perspectives, consider the power of forgiveness, and understand how simple acts of courage and kindness can break down walls and bring people together. Did this story touch your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced or witnessed something similar? We'd love to hear your perspective or any real-life stories of kindness and transformation. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring content.